Today's presentation is called Mastering the HDR Panorama Process. And today I have a special guest, Richard Sisk, who's a photographer based in Oregon, who is going to be sharing his tips and techniques for panorama photography. Richard's a professional that's been shooting panoramas commercially for over 20 years, so he has a deep wealth of experience both in traditional film photography as well as digital photography. He's also been one of the early adopters of our technology in the past, and has been sort of the thorn in my side for many features and egging us on to improve the software. So a lot of the features and functionalities that you'll see in this demonstration really come out of the collaboration that we've had with Richard over the years. The panorama feature, we call it the Pano Prep Batch Processing tool, is a new feature inside of HDR Expose 3.1. It was a free update that we just released last week. So if you haven't already done so, you can go to our website or use the tool inside the application to download the latest release. It's built version 3.1 that'll include this feature. So this webinar is not so much to discuss all of the features and functionality of HDR Expose 3. We're really focusing on what we're doing with this Pano Prep feature. So let's start off talking about the panorama process. A panorama is really a collection of multiple panels. When you go out to take a panorama scene, you set the camera up on the tripod, and you're taking multiple individual frames that you then want to stitch together to create a wide panorama or an immersive 360 pano, as it may be. The key thing here is that you want consistency when you do this. So that means you want to have manual exposure settings. So your camera has to be set to a fixed f-stop or aperture. You want to use a fixed shutter speed and a fixed ISO. You also want to have a fixed white balance. And finally, you want to have a fixed focus. So when you set up to do a panorama, you want everything to be consistent across the whole scene of the panorama and not have the camera make changes. If you have a system where the camera is set for automatic exposure, you can wind up with cases like this, where each image is evaluated on its own, and the contrast and the brightness and color temperature, for example, could vary between frames. And then when you try to stitch something like this together, you get a result that's less than pleasing, that looks like this. And here you can clearly see the lines between each one of these panels. So you've had these darker frames here. The camera is automatically compensated to obviously brighten the dark areas because it was in auto exposure mode. And here you're capturing the highlights, and then you're losing some of the shadow detail, and the color is changing across the scene. So color is and the manual settings are key for consistency. When you do tone mapping for panoramas, you have much of the same challenges. When you do the tone mapping, each panel would be individually optimized for exposure and contrast and color. And while each frame could stand on its own, when it's stitched together, it'll produce the same uneven results. So you would get something that looked like this as well. When you're creating HDR panoramas, it's very important to maintain this consistency, not only from the capture point, but through the whole processing. The way that this has been done in the past, the first solution is what I call the stitch first workflow. With a stitch first workflow, you would, in this case, I have, in this example, I have 3 different exposure brackets. So a +2, a 0 EV, and a -2. This is just as an example. You would stitch the panoramas together for each one of these exposure brackets. So now you have this very large image that you would then do the HDR merge process with. Now, there's a number of problems with the stitch first workflow. Stitching changes the image. You're often warping and distorting the image as part of the stitch process. The amount of warp and change could vary based on exposure. So then when you try to merge these together to create an HDR file, when you merge the exposure brackets, you can have geometrical differences between each one of these exposure brackets that will result in alignment problems during the merge process. You also are forced to use essentially a TIFF file as your source image for the HDR merge process. Now, TIFF files are great as final output, and we'll use them in this process as well when we go to the stitching step of the functionality. But they have clipped highlights and shadows, and they also have contrast curves applied to them that need to be undone as part of the HDR merge process. So given the choice, you always want to start with the linear raw files to do the HDR process. But the biggest disadvantage of the Stitch First workflow was huge file sizes. And let me just go into this a little bit. This particular example, I took this photograph a while back. This was taken with a Nikon D300, so it was a 12 megapixel camera. If I create a 16-bit TIFF file from this panorama, just one of the exposure brackets is 210 megabytes in size. And if I have only in this example, 3 brackets, that gives me a total of 630 megabytes just on the source files that I'm then trying to merge and tone map in the HDR software. So this can, files this size, and again, this is a 12 megapixel camera that's kind of dated. If you're working with a Canon 5D Mark III or a Nikon D800, this amount of data can really bring even the most powerful computer to its knees. So the workflow that we're able now to present with HDR Expose 3.1 is what I call Pano Prep Batch Processing workflow. So we're going to start off by merging the individual images and then tone mapping them and then saving them out as individual TIFF files that are equal in exposure that can then stitch together to create a really nice panorama. So the benefits of this, your exposure brackets are all treated equally. So there's not going to be a geometrical difference between the exposure brackets for a single panel. The resulting TIFF files are then easily stitched together to create a panorama. And you're using raw files as your source images for the merge process. So you have better quality, you don't have the clipped highlights or shadows, and that means that you're also less prone to posterization artifacts when you do your tone mapping. And you don't have the contrast curve built into the raw data. It's linear raw data. So you don't have that extra step that needs to be undone that also can produce posterization artifacts. And you have less noise using the raw linear data. Now, the biggest advantage is obviously the smaller file sizes. If I look at these now, so this is just a single panel. Each one of these is 20.3 megabytes. So in order to merge this single panel into an HDR image, it's 60.9 megabytes of source data per file versus 600. That's quite a savings and increases the performance and reduces the workload on your computer as well. Pano Prep Batch Processing is a two-step workflow. The first step is to do the batch merge. We're going to organize the exposure brackets into panorama scenes, and then we'll batch merge them and save them out as 32-bit HDR files that we then are able to take into the second step, which is the batch process mode. Here we'll load those 32-bit HDR images and then apply the uniform tone mapping preset to all of the images. Now, the trick around this, the breakthrough that we've had here is that we're able to view the whole panorama as a scene in software. So we're able to take the darkest shadow area out of the darkest corner of the panorama, and also compare that to the brightest highlight in the brightest area of the panorama, and then create um, the tone mapping calculations based on those extremes from all of the images in the panorama, not just a single frame, but all of the frames in the panorama shots. We treat the whole scene as one uniform image, and then apply those settings uniformly across all of the individual panels, so that when they're stitched together, it's seamless, and you don't have the variation that I showed before. Um, and we save these files out as individual TIFF files that we then stitch together with a third-party stitching app. Now, HDR Expose 3 only prepares the HDR tone mapping process of the panorama. That's why it's called the Pano Prep Batch Processing mode. We don't actually do the stitching. Stitching is best left to some of the applications that we'll be demonstrating today, where you're able to specialize in the panorama stitching functionality. And Richard is going to demonstrate that going forward. I just want to call out some of the elements of the user interface and how this is done, and then we'll go into a live demo of this. Like I said, it was a two-step process. The first step is doing the HDR merge, and then the second step is doing the processing. So in this screen, you'll see that the tab here says batch merge, and you'll see two panorama scenes here that are displayed, and each one of these is grouped together into a panorama scene. So the files are grouped together on the same line here, and within the scene, you have the individual panels. In this case, for this particular image, this is also one of the files that Richard was kind enough to share with us. This is a 3 exposure HDR capture. I think these were at +2, 0, and -2 EV. You can do 5 exposures, you can do 7 exposures. It really depends on the scene that you're trying to cover. And anyway, the software will automatically group these together in columns like this. And then you'll check the output file format. This is the 32-bit file format that you want to save that in. And in this case, I'm using our BEF file. And then you'll start the batch merge process. And when that's done, you'll go into the batch process tab. And now you're selecting the folder that contains these 32-bit BEF files. This is Unified Colors 32-bit file format. And then you're going to select the tone mapping preset that you want to use, and you pull that from the list. And these are the same presets that you see inside the software when you're working on an individual image. So you can create your own presets as you will for the best results. And then you choose your output file formats here. If you want JPEGs or TIFF, you can do 8-bit TIFF, 16-bit TIFF, or 8-bit JPEGs, and then the color space that you want to ICC color space that you want to use. And then you choose your output destination folder and you say OK, and then it goes off and creates your tone mapped TIFF images for this presentation. So instead of having something that looks like this now, where you have the difference in exposure and contrast between the panels, you get something that's uniform. And as I said, it takes the shadow information from the darkest image, which is this case, and the midtones and your highlights, and creates a singular set of parameters that it applies to all of the images in the scene. And then from that, you're able to stitch together a panorama that looks like this. And with that, let's launch into the demo. I'm going to bring Richard online. Richard, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Great. So I'm going to switch the screen over to you, make you the presenter. Okay, Richard. With that introduction, why don't we see what you have to share with us today?
Well, thank you, John. Yeah, John mentioned to me that most of us as photographers like gear, so I created a little panorama here. It's just an iPhone panorama, so excuse me for that. But
different tools for different jobs, right?
That's right. Well, as you can see, I'm into audio and visual, And so the audio is on the left. It's a hybrid system, digital and analog. Same thing with my photography. So on the right, you can see some of the gear that I use. And with that, let's go on into a little presentation here, a little slideshow. And this is at Jones Beach in New York in about 1950. And that's me there looking at the cameraman, my father, and thinking to myself, get a tripod, man. Your camera's crooked. But as you can see, I needed glasses even then. And now I do have some. And it's very helpful in that now I focus a little more correctly, although there are times when I miss just like anybody else. I'd like to invite everybody, when you have time, to visit my website, richardsiskproductions.com, and please give me feedback. If there's something you like, or if there's something you don't like, let me know, or if you'd like to see more of some type of images. I'll be adding a motion category soon, because years ago I was before I started this 20-year project creating panoramas, I did some documentary filmmaking. When you go through the website, you'll notice most of the images are analog, although you may not be able to tell one way or the other. But this is a camera that I used. It's called a VPan 617, 6 by 17 centimeter format. And these images can be scanned at 22,000 pixels high by approximately 66,000 pixels wide. So for large murals or for shooting something that stands still, I still use this thing. And I use this Imicon FlexTight scanner to scan the images. This is the equipment that I use most of the time for shooting panoramas nowadays. At the bottom, you see the remote control. If you're a Canon camera user, that comes in very handy because you can get as many brackets as you need to cover a scene with a lot of dynamic range. I use the Minolta Color Meter 3F, which allows me to measure the Kelvin color temperature very accurately. Most of this gear fits right into this little backpack, and so I'm pretty mobile with this process. One of the tricks about panoramas is that composition is critical. When I first started, having been a filmmaker before, I thought I knew a lot about composition, but I found out very quickly that my compositions lacked dynamics. And these lines that you see are mostly the golden mean lines, the ones in the center that are straight across, and then the ones near the center vertical lines are golden mean lines. And this helped me. I put this grid over the back of the camera. You'll see in a minute.
So for your digital work, you have this sort of this grid layout pre-visualized when you're looking at the scene, right?
Yeah, and they do have something in Photoshop that's similar that you can overlay on the crop with the crop tool so that you can see where your golden mean lines are. The intersections of those golden mean lines are the real power points. If you can place important elements on those intersections, your image will be far more powerful. And again, please visit my website if you have a chance, and I appreciate it if you do.
Okay, so let's, with that, thanks for sharing that. It's always, we get a lot of questions about the gear and, lenses, tripods, and that type of thing. So let's launch into the first demo. So we're going to start with a flat panorama. We're going to do two types of panoramas, or Richard is going to do two types of panoramas.
I'm going to try to do two.
A typical flat projection panorama. And we'll go through the whole workflow here from the Pano Prep Batch Processing mode in order to create those individual TIFF files that I mentioned and stitch together panorama. And then after that, we're going to do something which is really unique, and one of Richard's specialties is immersive, what do you call it, Richard? Immersive 360 VR?
Well, people call them all different kinds of things, but virtual reality tours seems to be the catchphrase nowadays.
And those are used a lot now, also commercially for real estate and for tours of buildings, environments. I've seen it used all over the place, so it's really interesting. And when you have a scene worth doing a 360 tour, you're more likely than not to have high contrast scenes, windows, and outdoor exposures and stuff in it. So this is going to be a real treat. Let's start with the flat pano first.
Okay, John is exactly right with panoramas, whether they're immersive panoramas or regular, we might refer to as flat panoramas. You always wind up with an enormous dynamic range. Now, when I use film, I have to allow it to clip on the highlights and the shadows. Fortunately, we still have film. I don't know how much longer, but let's go in and take a look at this new wonderful feature of HDR Expose 3.1. One of the things you'll notice right away is that, as John mentioned earlier, the software will take an entire folder of raw images and separate the panoramas so that you can process all of them if you choose, or just one. In this case, we're going to process just one. So let's select those images, and let's take a look at the batch merge feature. So I've selected the raw images for the panorama, and I would like to make sure that I select BEF because I want to create a 32-bit file for subsequent tone mapping. And then I want to make sure that I have selected an output destination folder, and which I have done here.
Right.
And I want to select merge static photos, and I'm not going to select this one right now. As John mentioned, it's kind of a good idea to process those BEF 32-bit files first. So let's go ahead and do that. And as soon as you click that, you'll notice
the process to final is kind of a shortcut that once you have a workflow down and you want to just expedite stuff, you can go straight from the original raw files all the way out to the final tone map TIFF files. But for this webinar demonstration, we really want to go through the individual steps to show you the differences. And for those of you who are familiar with the software, the interface is very similar to the standard batch processing interface that we use for working on single scene images versus the panorama. So the real difference here with the panorama merge process that's happening, as I mentioned, is that we're evaluating all of the images that are used to create the panorama as a whole entity, looking for the shadows and the highlight information in order to create the uniform tone mapping parameters across all of them.
that's right. Now, I've also created these files just in the interest of saving some time here. Do you want to just go straight to the BEFs that I've already created, John?
Finish.
So let it finish? Okay.
Finish, yeah, so you see it in real time. So
it's already finished?
Yep.
Well, that was faster than I expected. Okay, that's great. Let's take a look and see if there's anything in my file folder now. So we're looking for BEFs. They should be in here. I put them in this file folder, and there they are.
There they are.
Very good. Very good.
So these are our 32-bit BEF files. And can you do a get info just on one of them so we can see how big they are?
You bet.
So
22.5 megabytes.
22.5 megabytes, which is actually a decent size as a result of our BEF file format.
Absolutely.
So let's go back into Expose 3 and do the batch processing step.
Right. We'll go back in here. And now I will click Batch Process. And I want to choose the files that I just created. So let's do that. I want to make sure that I don't get too terribly confused here. But I'm looking for BEFs, Maroon Bells, BEFs 2. And there they are. Well, John, this actually seems to work.
That's good. So now we're looking at the 32-bit BEF files from this particular pano. So now we have merged the exposure brackets into and created these 32-bit BEF file formats. That's what we're going to start with now for our tone mapping process. So um, you also see that we have the source filters there on the side, and you can see that in this folder there are actually 5 BEF files that we're going to work with. And you have a custom preset that you created for this particular scene, right?
Right, and that's one of the nice things. What we're doing now is we're taking that 32-bit series of BEF files, which have been processed uniformly, as John said, which is so critical in this particular case. And we're going to tone map those images, and then the software will convert them into 16-bit TIFF files. We have some options here that are built into the software that are really terrific. And one of my favorite is optimal. It does a good job. If you're just getting started with the software, I suggest you give that a try. But the nice part is that you can design your own presets. And so I designed a preset for this. I called it Canon Pop 2. So let's give that one a try. Now, I'm not saying that that's a great preset. I think I'll be doing more work and creating more presets in the weeks to come. And so we're going to convert that to a TIFF 16-bit, Adobe RGB 1998, and then the destination folder will be this one, Maroon TIFF Stitch 2. Let's go ahead and choose that and say OK. And another nice thing, another nice feature, John, that you guys came up with was this idea of cleaning up this processing window so you can see how you're doing.
Right.
And if you notice, it processes these pretty quickly, and it's converting them into TIFF files. They're going to have uniform brightness across the panorama. So, you know, I don't know how John's Wizards came up with this idea, but I think John came up with the idea, but they had to implement it, and it wasn't easy.
Yeah, coming up with the ideas is always the simple part. I also want to point out that this is a background process in the software. So if you want to go off and do something else while this is happening, you can do that. You could work on other images in the application while the batch processing is happening in the background. So now we've created the TIFF file, so you'll quit out of Expose 3.